That's to show me?
No, that's to record you.
That's
Oh, can we press the video as well?
I did already.
No, Danny, it's not on.
There's a red mark there.
I stand corrected. You did turn it on. This one's not on.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. I won't use my professorial voice. It only carries as far as the first row. But I left the house together with Ron and Pat Davis, and of course we were very late. But when I stood outside, my neighbor came over to me and he noticed I wasn't wearing my usual jeans and torn t-shirt. And he said, "Are you going to a party?" And I said, "Yes, I am going to a party. And this is a party to celebrate Ron and his life and all the wonderful people who are here. And we have very special treats for you, not only the reminiscences and the warm and funny memories that we all have, but we also have, and this really is a treat, we have Ron Leonard, the former chief cellist, first cellist of the LA Phil. And after Dan Schaffer speaks very briefly, Ron is going to come and he's going to play from Bach's Suite to movements. And that will be a very lovely way to begin, and then we will go into the program. Thank you all for coming. Lovely to see so many old friends here. And when I say old, I mean old.
Well, yes, thank you all for so much for coming. And as Reva said, we're here to celebrate my father's life. I think it's just, I think to me, a lot of you are here because of who he was as a person. He was such a kind person. And that's what I think about most about him. And it's just great to see all of you. And, you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I'll probably lose it, and I don't want to do that. But one of the things that especially, you know, his colleagues from CSUN knew is he was always making fun of our politicians, the buffoons and crooks that we had. Like, you know, he loved Nixon so much and all that. And I think wasn't the checker speech he used to play in his classes, and he'd wear, I don't know if that was when he wore a Mickey Mouse hat and he'd play that for the students. And one of the things that I was sorriest about his illness, because, you know, for me, I lost my dad several years ago, not September 1st, when he got ill. And one of the things that both my mom and I missed was having him there to talk about, who's that guy that's our president now? I don't know what his name is, but here's what I think he would say if he was here, is that I think there's more people here that we've seen since Obama's second inauguration. So think about that for a little bit. So that's really all I wanted to say right now. I just wanted to really thank you so much for being part of this and enjoy remembering my father. I'm going to just say one more thing.
We're getting the step out so that I'm not invisible behind the lectern. And Dan is helping me get up on the step, and then he's going to help me get down from the step.
Right?
Hello.
Also, I just want to ask, I have to ask if anybody has their ringers on or their cell phone, just a reminder to turn it off. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I should have thought of that. Well, that was so lovely. Thank you, Ron Leonard, for playing for us. It really was a beautiful way to start this. Ron loved parties. He wasn't exactly a party animal. I don't recall him dancing on tables, but he did love parties, and he would have loved to have been here, and he is here with us in spirit. And Jenny now is going to talk about that.
Danny, can you? Yeah. Actually, let's leave it down. Reba has to keep coming back.
You'll be very tall.
Okay. Hello. I played the cello really badly in high school, and my poor father, who could name any composition and any composer when he heard it on the radio, who loved music, and my poor mother, who also loves music, had to hear me practice. So we should really take a moment to be grateful that I'm not playing the cello at my dad's memorial, but instead the first chair of the LA Phil is here. So I also just want to say how extraordinary it is to see all of you here. You all sort of populate the landscape of my childhood and my memories. You all come from these different parts. Someone needs to let in some people at the door. Come from these different parts of my life, and it just feels so miraculous to have you all here. I want to just begin with kind of a side note. I want to thank all of you who have been there for my mom during this period of my father's illness and his death, because my brother and I don't live here. We live far away, and it's been a huge comfort for us to know that you're there, seeing films with my mom and, talking about books and playing bridge and cooking and eating and laughing and being sad with her. And I know my dad would have appreciated it too. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you who have been holding my mom during this time. Is this even on? Okay. The first time I lost someone, I learned that when someone dies, they really do take a whole universe with them, like a world of sense memory and stories and inside jokes and associations. And so it's basically impossible for me to convey the huge universe that was my dad and the world he made for me and the world he made with me. So I'm not going to talk that long. Mainly what I want to say is that my father gave. He gave me gifts. He was himself a gift. I've never felt like a lucky person in my life, but I feel like I pretty much won the dad lottery. He gave me a love of humor, of language and wordplay, love of foreign languages, music, art, a love of nuance, subtlety, a love of looking at things from 15 degrees off center instead of straight on. I make experimental abstract theater because of him. I write comedic monologues because of him, and I tell ironic, many-layered, obtuse jokes that no one ever gets because of him. My father, both in his actions and in his words, taught me that men can be sweet and good and thoughtful and kind. He was a pretty heady guy, as you all know. He was an intellectual, an egghead, but I could always feel his heart underneath all of that. His love for my mom was beautiful. He was unerring and loyal. He fell in love with her and never looked back. He modeled for me and my brother what it looks like when someone really loves a spouse and devotes themselves to that person. And I think it was a profound lesson for me and my brother to see that every day. My father gave me the strong connection I have to Italy. He told me that if I was ever away from home and bored, I should find the Italians. So the summer that I was 17, I was living in a super boring part of France, taking super boring French classes from nuns. And as it happens, there were some Italians studying there, so I sought them out, and we hung out at the nunnery and ate cookies and spoke to each other in broken French and laughed loudly, and the nuns had to keep telling us to be quiet. Later, one of these same Italians invited me to live with her family in a small rural town in northern Italy, And now I have a whole community, kind of a second family there, and they met my dad and my mom, and they remember them very well. And they've been with me from 6,000 miles away through this time of grief since we lost our dad. When I was a kid, I would... oh, wait, there's something missing from here, you guys. Oh, I'm going to have to improvise this. It's missing. I want to thank my dad for Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and Xavier Cugat and all of classical music and the whole wide world of jazz. He had really cool records, and he played them, and they were part of my childhood. When I was a kid, I would be sitting somewhere in the house, and my dad would come find me, and he'd say, "You have to come see this." And I would follow him out to the yard, or he would point through the window and say, "Look how that plant is blooming. Look at that flower. Do you see the way the moon is tonight? Isn't that incredible? Look at this hilarious pose the cat is in on that big rock in our backyard. Look at how that blue jay is dive bombing again in the yard." He shared himself, really, and he saw beauty and he saw humor and he shared it, and he really taught me to see. My dad saw me and my brother as we were. He never asked us or needed us to be anybody other than who we were. He always respected us, and he accepted us, and he loved us, and that's really the biggest gift. I was going to close with a poem about cats, because the poem is because he loved cats, first of all, and later during his illness he started hallucinating, but he only ever hallucinated the same thing over and over again, which was cats. He kept thinking he was seeing cats. I think I will read it, because I mean, it's a little bit odd that I would talk about cats at my dad's memorial rather than say fathers or daughters or whatever, but the poem is sort of about being yourself, and it's about beauty, so I'm going to read it. It's called Ode to the Cat by Pablo Neruda. The animals were imperfect, long-tailed, unfortunate in their heads. Little by little, they put themselves together, making themselves a landscape, acquiring spots, grace, flight. The cat, only the cat, appeared complete and proud. He was born completely finished, walking alone and knowing what he wanted. Man wants to be fish or fowl. The snake would like to have wings. The dog is a disoriented lion. The engineer would like to be a poet. The fly studies to be a swift. The poet tries to imitate the fly. But the cat only wants to be a cat. And any cat is a cat, from his whiskers to his tail, from his hopeful vision of a rat to the real thing, from the night to his golden eyes. There is no unity like him. The moon and the flower do not have such context. He's just one thing, like the sun or the topaz. And the elastic line of his contours is firm and subtle, like the line of a ship's prow. His yellow eyes have just one groove to coin the gold of nighttime. O little emperor without a sphere of influence, conqueror without a country, smallest living room tiger, nuptial sultan of the sky, of the erotic roof tiles, the wind of love. In the storm you claim when you pass and place your 4 delicate feet on the ground, smelling, distrusting all that is terrestrial because everything is too unclean for the immaculate foot of the cat. O independent wild beast of the house, arrogant vestige of the night, lazy, gymnastic, and alien. My mom's going to relate to this about her cat. Very deep cat, secret policeman of bedrooms, insignia of a disappeared velvet. Surely there is no enigma in your manner. Perhaps you're not a mystery. Everyone knows of you, and you belong to the least mysterious inhabitant. Perhaps everyone believes it. Everyone believes himself the owner, proprietor, uncle of a cat, companion, colleague, disciple, or friend of his cat. Not me. I do not subscribe. I do not know the cat. I know it all, life in its archipelago, the sea and the incalculable city, botany, the gymnasium and its frenzies, the plus and minus of mathematics, the volcanic frauds of the world, the unreal shell of the crocodile, the unknown kindness of the fireman, the blue atavism of the priest. But I cannot decipher a cat. My reason slips on his indifference. His eyes have golden numbers. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, guys.
I think every one of us, who knew Ron knew a different Ron, because he was a very complex person. And whoever he was with, he tried very hard to be with them. And I listened to both Jenny and Dan, and one of the things that Ron said to me that they recalled for me is that he never believed in magic until his children were born. And he said that was the most magical thing he'd ever seen, each one of them. And he didn't often say personal things like that, but that was very personal, and that was very true. And he loved Robbie, of course, as both of you said, and he adored his children. So that was very nice. I think of Ron as one of nature's good people. There aren't many nature's good people, but he was one of them. He was kind, he was helpful, he was passionate about the things he believed in. He was a good and loyal friend, he was a good colleague. He did everything as best he could to do it right. He believed in doing everything right, whatever it was. And for him, right was a moral issue. It was an issue of rectitude, it was an issue of intellect, and he always tried to get it right. His generosity, I think all of you have experienced that. It was a pleasure, it was a gift, as Jenny said, to all of us. He was, I remember one instance in which we went out for lunch, a bunch of us, as we often did. And I think some of the people sitting here may have been there, and our colleague Rena Vassar was there. She was not generous. And there was some discussion over the bill about a glass of wine. And Rena thought that she shouldn't pay for it because she didn't have any. And the rest of us were just splitting it. And Ron said to her, "I will pay for it." And she said, "You didn't drink it either." And he said, "That's why I will pay for it." It was very typical of Ron. He was also, and some of you may not know this, he was a big advocate of women's rights. Way before there were advocates of women's rights. He was very strong about that. And sometimes it took a funny turn. We were together at a conference in Portland. And we got out of the airport together, and he said, "Let's rent a car and we can drive around." I said, "Wonderful idea." And we rented the car, and he handed me the keys. He said, "Here, you drive." And I said, "Okay, you sure you don't want to drive?" "No," he said, "I'm tired of seeing women put upon and having men do all the driving. I think women should have an opportunity." I didn't want to drive. I mean, I was very happy to let him drive, but he was insistent on that because he thought it was something that I should be doing because a woman should be doing these things. So I drove there, he drove back. I mean, but that was the kind of thing that interested him even then. He fought for all the things he believed in, tirelessly, as his family can attest, and never gave it up, never conceded defeat. And he was a party person. He loved parties. And I remember in his house, Robbie would complain he was so enjoying the party, he forgot to fill up everybody's drink. And he forgot it was at his house they were having the party, instead of at somebody else's house. And another incident I recall where, again, he was so enjoying it, he forgot where he was at his house. We had come back from some strife-riven meeting. All our meetings were strife-riven. And we had come into the house, and both children were children then, and there was somebody taking care of them, a young woman, I think she was a student, and she had just baked chocolate chip cookies. And they filled the air with the scent of these cookies. And we came in, we sat down, and Ron didn't offer anybody a cookie. And I said to him, "Ron, aren't we going to have any cookies?" "Oh, cookies!" He said, "Of course." And he rushed and gave it was not because he was mean, not because he wasn't generous, but because he forgot it was his house and he was supposed to be doing those things. was very typical of him. He was a good man in every sense of the word good. He did well, but he was also very good. I'm not going to talk about his scholarship because I'm going to leave it to the American historians to discuss that. But I will talk about his intellect and about his loyalty. I know whenever I gave a talk, wherever it happened to be, Ron was in the audience. He would travel long distances, and I would say to him, "What are you doing here?" And he would say, "You're talking, I'm here." And he would be there. And it was always a surprise and a pleasure. And I said to him once, "Why do you come?" And you've heard me before. My husband doesn't come to hear me. When everybody asks him, "Why don't you come?" He said, "I've heard her speak." But Ron came, and he always said he came because that's what a university was about. And he wanted to be part of that kind of university. He was somebody we will all miss. But we should remember all the wonderful things that he did and the humor. He loved jokes. Whenever we met, the first thing he said to me was, "You have a new joke? Can you tell me a new joke?" And he loved, as Jenny said, he loved jokes that are plays on words, and he loved political jokes. So I will tell you one that he would have loved had he been here. 2 Hasidic scholars come out of Marcus Pincus's tailor shop, and they're wearing their new regalia. And one says to the other, looking at his sleeve in the sunshine, he says, "This isn't black, it's blue." And the other one says, "Don't be absurd. Marcus Pincus has been a Hasidic tailor for 40 years. Of course it's black." He looks at it again. He says, "No, I think it's blue." And as he speaks, 2 nuns approach. And the one who thinks it's blue says to the other one, "Look, those nuns are wearing black. When they get close, I'm going to stick my arm out, and I'm going to compare it to their habits, and we'll know if it's black." Meanwhile, the 2 nuns are talking. And the young nun says to the older nun, "Oh, look, here come 2 priests." The older nun says, "No, they're not priests, they're Hasidic scholars." And the younger nun says, "No, I think they're priests." And the older nun says, "Well, we can tell when we get close to them. Listen to what they're saying. If they're speaking Latin, they're priests. If they're speaking Hebrew, they're Hasidic scholars." They get close, he sticks out his arm, they walk by, and the young nun says, "I told you they were priests." And the older one said, "What did they say?" She said, "They were speaking Latin." And she said, "What?" And they said, "Marcus Pincus fucked us." Ron would have loved that. And one other that he would have loved. This is about the man who goes into a bar and he sees that the bartender is a robot, and he's astonished to see a robot. The robot says, "What will you have, sir?" He says, "Whiskey." He's served a whiskey. The robot says, "What is your IQ, sir?" He says, 162. And the robot launches into a discussion of black holes, the latest development in genetics, and all sorts of ultra-intellectual things. And the man is astonished. And he leaves, he gets outside, and he says to himself, "I wonder what he would have said if I told him a lower IQ." He goes back. Robot says, "What will you have?" He says, "Whiskey." Drinks. And robot says, "What is your IQ?" He says, 100. And the robot launches into a discussion of the latest baseball games, the football games, the soccer games. And he leaves, and he says, "I wonder what would happen if I told him a really low IQ." He goes back, he's served the whiskey. He says, "What is your IQ?" He says, 50. And the robot leans forward and says, "And how do you people feel about Trump now?" On that note, we will go to our next speaker. It's Ron Davis.
You know, I have to say, though, that I know the real reason why Ron Schaffer would show up at Reba's talks. The reason Ron would show up at Reba's talks is because he would never hear the end of it if he didn't. And I know. Well, let's talk about Ron Schaffer. I've titled my little thoughts about him as Ron Schaffer, the young and then old Devil Ron. At least that is how he was viewed by university apparatchiks, meaning those folks who were paid to manage students at faculty and its students and faculty at CSUN. He was always, I must tell you, you'll find this hard to believe, he was always their worst nightmare. When university administrators saw Ron coming their way in the faculty senate, where he served for I think 13 or 14 years, or in the numerous faculty committees on which he served. I was trying to tabulate today by looking over some of my old notes, just how many of these did he serve on. And believe me, over his many, many years, I think it was like 36 at all levels of the university. They knew that when they saw Ron coming their way, they would be held accountable and that they had to be ready for a fight. If they tried to violate faculty rights, if they tried to infringe on academic freedom, or if they tried to water down education on campus. He was a warrior in that way. But the funny thing about Ron is that these apparatchiks also liked him, and they respected him, as did almost everyone who knew him. He was, for them, and for many, an enigma. They knew that he was one of the most respected scholars and teachers in the CSU system, attested to by the books that he wrote and the prizes that he won. And they also knew that he was an incredible teacher. They knew this because he was awarded the Distinguished Teaching Award and because of the accolades of so many students who used to fill up his office and follow him around. Obviously, they must have surmised Ron Schaffer must be in league with the devil. Clearly, he was part of a devil's brigade composed of the likes of Paul Koistinen, Sheldon Harris, Reba Sofer, John Brazenly, Alan Deeren, Julia Nava in the history department, and comrades throughout the university like Warren Bland and Robert Chianese, Bill Walsh, Pat Nicholson, and others. And yet, unlike their feelings for his fellow travelers, most of whom were not liked and not respected by the administration, they really liked Ron as a person. It was the strangest thing. He was both a devil and an angel in their eyes. Really amazing. They must have told himself that such is the way the devil works his ways. Well, was Ron Schaffer actually a devil? Well, I can tell you that he was. Indeed, those of us who counted him as a dear friend know that he lived proud indeed of his demonic accomplishments, happy for what he had done, pleased that his life at CSUN caused such consternation and bewilderment among those who held power and privilege that he thought often was undue. Let's look for a moment at his devilish accomplishments at the university. When I first met Ron in 1970, he handed me a union card and asked me when I was going to join the faculty. He didn't ask me about my work. He didn't ask me about my family. He said, "Here's a union card." And I did so immediately. Warren Bland tells me in a note that he sent that too was his first contact with Ron when he joined the faculty in 1968. Ron continued throughout his career to be not only a strong advocate of the union, he also served as an officer in the more radical United Professors of California and worked tirelessly to promote collective bargaining for the faculty. He was a champion of the faculty in that sense. And he also served as a support person on many faculty grievances undertaken by the union in support of faculty rights. And doing this work, always presuming that the aggrieved person should receive due process no matter how scandalous the charges leveled against him or her, such as sexual harassment, selling grades, or treating colleagues in ways considered offensive. Most of these grievances, of course, involved tenure issues, retention issues, promotion issues, but there were some real doozies that were also part of the record. And Ron never prejudged them. He always stood up and said, due process is what's important. I sometimes think that if he had been a lawyer, he would have been a mafia lawyer. But his union work was but a small part of the work Devil Ron did to promote academic freedom and faculty governance on campus. There are so many instances that would take several hours to detail them all, so I will mention only a few. There was the time that Devil Ron helped organize and support a faculty boycott of the campus bookstore for its alleged violation of free speech when the administration decided to ban certain publications from being sold there. Ron and others, especially John Brazenly, were lions in this battle. And boy, did that one get a lot of press attention. There were the numerous pickets and protest demonstrations that Ron participated in or helped organize in support of faculty salaries, often demonstrations at the Chancellor's office in Long Beach or on the CSUN campus at various campus events. He used to like to help organize pickets of the president's breakfast hours whenever there was some issue that was in dispute. And he was always there in his full academic regalia. Professor Ron Schaffer, scholar Ron Schaffer, teacher extraordinaire Ron Schaffer, walking the picket line. The battle to block the effort to create a special committee to monitor student complaints regarding faculty speech in the classrooms was not something that Ron let pass easily. And that was a real battle that pitted not only the administration against Ron and his efforts, but even fellow faculty. The battle to block administrative efforts to do away with Pan-African studies and Chicano studies as separate departments found a champion in Ron. The move by Ron and fellow travelers to refuse to teach or hold office hours in structures deemed unsafe after the Northridge earthquake was something that he really threw his heart into, refusing to go into structures that were deemed unsafe and sending memos signed by dozens and dozens of faculty to the legislature. His work as a mentor in the educational equity program and his battle with the administration over how it should be funded and operated stand out in my mind as another example of his commitment to equity and justice in dealing with what we might think of as students with certain economic disadvantages. And there was more, but for me, the day that he and I resigned from the Faculty Senate after serving 13 years in that body in protest of the way Senate officers routinely ignored or tried to avoid faculty criticism is something that I will always, always remember. I still have the newspaper coverage and treasure the photo of Ron and me, the two Rons, sitting together for an interview on the campus lawn to a Sundial reporter. And I especially remember Ron's quote, explaining his decision to give up his seat in the Senate, where, believe me, he had been such a champion and such an advocate, it was not an easy thing for him to do. But he said, in his usual non-pretentious way, it's just that I don't think that I should spend my time there anymore if I don't have the opportunity to change the minds of other people. And with that, he resigned. But is the photo in the newspaper of Ron and me sitting there that tells me so much about why Ron was such a mysterious fellow to people who really didn't know him. It is the smile on his face. It was always there. He just never stopped smiling. Not quite like a Cheshire cat, no, not like that. More like a devil who always knew that while the powerful have power, they don't have much else. Who knew that what they were doing was really absurd and that he was in on the joke. And it was that smile and his uncanny ability to treat others, even his most formidable enemies, with decorum and respect as a human being that made him so likable even to those who truly relished and celebrated the day he retired. Unlike some of us who enjoy the looks of apoplexy caused by outrageous actions, Ron was always the professional, always the measured gadfly, always the man who could smile and shake your hand and be a gentleman with you, no matter the conflict. That was the Ron I will always remember. And I must say to you that I did not visit Ron in his later days. I simply didn't want to see him that way. I have personally kind of a problem with those kinds of things. I didn't want to remember Ron any other way than the way I do remember him. With that, I'm going to close with reading you a letter. This is a letter that was written. He may not even remember it. Probably I will embarrass him a little. This was written about his father by Dan Schaffer. And it's an interesting letter because it captures Ron in a way that I think only his son and daughter can really, and his wife can really see him. He sent this to me after we had a retirement party for Ron. And he said, if only I could have thought about delivering this little talk when everybody was there, because in my mind it really captures my father. And I'm going to read it to you. My sister mentioned many of the names that came up repeatedly during our dinner conversations over the years. One name she admitted was Richard Nixon. As many of you know, my father was a big fan of the president. What you may not know is that this admiration and respect continues to this day. Ron hated Nixon. This January, his grandchildren, Justin and Melanie, visited him in Northridge. Justin was heard to say, "But Grandpa, why can't we go to Disneyland instead of visiting the Nixon Library again?" The discussion of the greatness, in quotes, of Nixon lasted throughout our lives. "Excuse me, I have just been handed a bulletin," says Dan. Apparently, Press Secretary Ron Ziegler Davis will be coming out to read a statement from Ron Schaffer, and here is the statement. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the message from Ron Schaffer that he was asked me to read to you. And here's Ron, at least as his children see him. My fellow historians, 35 years ago, you appointed me to the position of historian at California State University, Northridge. At that time, I promised you I would hold the office with the highest of honor and integrity. Throughout these years, myself, my wife, Roberta, and our dog, Checkers, have tried to keep that promise. You will recall that we defended the interests of the history department by ordering their tear gassing of student protesters, the bombing of the administration building, the wiretapping of President Cleary's home and office, and later by bringing about détente with President Cleary. Now, however, recent events have come to play. The local press has misrepresented the 17-minute gap in tapes of conversation in the history department office. They have implied that the tape contained information implicating me in a scheme to illegally take control of the chairmanship of the department. They have distorted the truth, which is that a 17-minute power outage took place that day. I am not a crook, said Ron. However, it has now become apparent that I have lost my political base in the faculty as well as the administration, the state legislature, and Jeanette Rankin's family. Therefore, I, Ronald Milhouse Schaffer, shall resign the office of historian effective January 2000. The vice historian, my good friend Paul Gerald R. Koisteman, who can't chew gum and walk at the same time, will be sworn in as the new historian. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the history department. That's from Dan. And you can tell from this letter that indeed his father drilled them and talked to them, and I should say probably propagandized them with a particular ACLU liberal, AKA commie perspective on life. And I always cherish that about Ron, and I'll always cherish that smile. Thank you. Remember that one? She said I talk too much.
Only reason Ron didn't come to all my talks is he couldn't find the way there. Otherwise he would have been there. I only say that because he couldn't find the way here today. We made an enormous circle throughout the whole valley before we got here. Our next speaker, John Brazenly, is somebody who Ron respected enormously. And John, if you will turn to the back of this, if you haven't already seen that, John has written a really splendid obituary. And I think it's something Ron would have, in his all this modesty, said, is he talking about me? And yes, he is talking about him. And John is going to come now and talk some more. Where are you, John? I don't think I have to get up every minute. Do you think I have to get up? No, we can do without me. Okay, I'm going to sit down, I think, until the end. It's going to help me from not falling off the stool.
Can you hear me satisfactorily? No? Better?
It's good.
Good?
It's good.
Yeah.
Trying hard. Thank you, Reba. Several decades ago, the members of the Northridge History Department began to see Ron in somewhat of a different light. We'd always known him in the ways that Reba described and in the way that Ron described as a superb colleague, warm and witty. That was Ron. Ron recalls his perennial smile, and I do as well, but also that little chuckle. Remember the chuckle? That was Ron. That was Ron. But also, as Ron Davis stressed, we recall him as a highly principled colleague, a champion of faculty rights, prerogatives, faculty governance, an outstanding advocate for us, all of us. And we knew him as a fine teacher, as Ron mentioned, a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, known throughout the system for his teaching. We now realized several decades ago that he was becoming a scholar who was attracting a national following. And that was the change that we began to see in Ron and in our perception of Ron. because a whole lot more people around the country within the field of American scholarship had their own perception of Ron. This emergence as a scholar with a national following emerged at mid-career, and it emerged remarkably rapidly over a relatively brief period of time, thanks to a sequence of publications about American military history. The first, the United States in World War I, a selected bibliography published by Clio in 1978, was a kind of preliminary, the beginning of the procession. And then came two articles in the Journal of American History focusing on American military ethics in World War II. And about that time, Ron began giving a whole series of papers on the moral issues revolving around American strategic bombing during the Second World War. This was not military history in a conventional sense at all. This was something different. It was something bigger, and it was something with a very different focus. What brought that into high relief was what I think of as Ron's magnum opus, Wings of Judgment, published by Oxford University Press in 1985. Path-breaking examination of the strategic and ethical complexities revolving around its subject. And following that was America and the Great War, The Rise of the War Welfare State, published again by Oxford in 1991. A searching study of the myriad ways in which World War I changed the nature of American society and concentrated permanently the power of the federal government. Wings of Judgment and America in the Great War each received the university's Scholarly Publication Award. He had two of them. Wings was reviewed widely, among other places, in the New York Review of Books. Subsequently, and this was in the late 1990s, Ron consulted with KCET for two documentaries, The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, and Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of the American Century. The World War I series by KCET won 2 Emmys and received a Peabody. Following his retirement in 1999, Ron began work on a book about American aviators in World War I, asking what led young men to volunteer so avidly to fly machines that were so extremely likely to get them killed. It was a book that all of us who knew about it were waiting to read. And all of us who were waiting to read it dearly wish he'd been able to complete it. But then he'd already completed so very much. At Cal State Northridge with his colleagues and his students, and more broadly, through his impact among the profession at large, he was truly singular.
You want me to introduce you?
Grab that.
Oh, yeah, I can grab it. Sure, thank you. Ron joined the history department in 1965. In short order, the department faculty realized that I had a real winner in its ranks, and it was both in the teaching and scholarship area. In the classroom, Ron brought a full and concrete coverage of the subject, enriched by originality and controversy. When the subject and class were appropriate, Ron's reading list included volumes such as Catch-22 and The Feminine Mystique. He had little respect for those scholars or instructors who would not or could not put in the hard work that good teaching required. Such faculty turned instead to showing random and unrelated movies, or read 5/8 notes, the work of others, in a really, for Ron, a shameful way. To show his contempt for such instructors, Ron occasionally wore to class a beanie with a stick protruding and at the top a propeller. He would explain, when asked to do so, what it meant. It meant, he said, poor teaching leads to jokes. Not jokes told by the instructor, but just the process of what they were doing. And he did this to get not only share his thinking about them, but also to get a class to share their thinking about them with him and their classmates. Concerning research and publication, Ron worked on a number of areas. The most important was bombing during World War II. Here, as usual, he focused on largely unexplored and controversial territory. Once tactical and strategic goals had been met, was it moral to continue what we might call vengeance bombing? His publication on the topic quickly led to debate, panel discussions, and publications stressing a different interpretation and approach. With the introduction of atomic warfare near the end of the Second World War, its use against Japan, and the growing sophistication and proliferation of the weaponry, it demonstrates what Ron's emphasis embalming made early. In both the teaching and scholarship area, what Ron pursued, he enlightened and enriched. A rare and enviable talent. So, Ron, rest in peace, my valued colleague and friend, for a job more than well done and a life of virtue and goodness.
John Irving.
All right.
Well done, sir.
Uh, All right. Thank you very much.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is John Irving, and I'm representing a different discipline, Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, and I'm an outsider in this group, certainly. And I know Ron, or I knew Ron from a different areas. We had a faculty book club for many years, and Ron was the guiding spirit of that book club. And I joined the book club with Ron at the beginning, and we were the veterans of the group. And I must say, over the years, I came to think of Ron the way I used to think of in my childhood of the good humor man, because Ron was the good humor man. He was always in a good humor, no matter what the situation. And I was in this book group with him, and also in a Civil War group with him, and things got pretty acrimonious at the Civil War meetings particularly, and Ron was always, what shall I say, in a good humor, somehow able to deal with any situation, any problem, in a very dispassionate way. And I was always impressed and actually admired the way Ron handled conflict in groups. That was my impression of him, that he was somehow not only brilliant in his contributions to both the book group and to the Civil War group, but he was also able to somehow deal with conflict in these groups and somehow always say the right thing, always have some interesting point to bring out. And so I was always terribly impressed with the way Ron handled situations like that. So I have a totally different relationship with Ron than most of you who were colleagues. And I somehow always admired Ron because of his broad knowledge, not just of history, but of literature. He was able to contribute all kinds of interesting things to our literary discussions. And I know that he was a great opera lover. Culturally, he was in all different areas, painting, opera, and he could somehow contribute to any discussion on any subject. So, but most of all, I was just impressed with his, what shall I say, his good humor in all kinds of situations, and some of the others here in this group have pointed that out. Anyway, I don't have anything more to say. Oh, I did want to remember to mention one thing, that I also visited him when he was at Aegis, the last couple of years on several occasions. And he was his same charming self. The people at Aegis loved him, and he was, sort of a great delight to be around, whatever the situation. And so I just wanted to bring that in as just another aspect of Ron. He was just a wonderful person, and I will miss him and do miss him terribly. Thank you.
We've got Jim Sefton is next.
Are we on?
We are on.
Yes, we are. Okay. Ron and I both taught military history, but we taught it in different ways. And that, I think, was one of the benefits of having two military historians together. He was more interested in policy issues, whereas I was more focused on operational history. So we didn't get in each other's way, which was good, and students could profit from both of our approaches, and we frequently passed students around from one to the other. As a scholar, Dr. Schaffer is best known for his important 1985 book, Wings of Judgment, American Strategic Bombing in World War II. That was a widely praised effort to examine the choices that American military pioneers or planners made in the strategic bombing campaigns in the Second World War. He also published America and the Great War, The Rise of the War Welfare State. That was from Oxford University Press. A study of the ways that U.S. participation in the war contributed to the rising influence of the federal government in American life. And it isn't stopping, is it? Both of his books won CSUN's Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award. He also published numerous articles on American military history and the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Ronald was a great credit to the department. There were political splits, right and left. When I came into the department in 1965, the issues were essentially twofold. One was the war in Vietnam, and whether or not the department should take some kind of a position on the war. And then secondly was the issue of faculty unionization. And Ron was, of course, in the leadership of the second one, and he was also opposed to the war in Vietnam. So there were issues early on in my service in the department and in the period that Ron Schaffer served. That's particularly important to understand, because if you have a department that doesn't talk about these things, you have a department that's pretty dull and boring. And our department was never dull and boring. There were some hot department meetings from time to time, and it was fairly clear that certain people did not go to lunch with other people. But on the other hand, it was a congenial department, and it was a pleasant place to be. So I am happy to remember Ron as a colleague, as a friend whom I enjoyed. And I also have another line of connection with him because he had a fatal illness that I am quite aware of, thanks to the people at Kaiser. Okay? So thank you all for being here. I think I'm the last speaker.
Oh, no, Jim Allen.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'll simply say stick around and hear the last speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
We're Jim Allen is up.
Many years ago, can you hear me? Many years ago, I think it was the 1980s, the history department was arranging, I think once a year or so, some soiree over in the Grand Salon or whatever that place was at the Student Union, and they would invite some distinguished historian from outside our campus to speak, and they had a catered dinner. And I guess this was, Ron would call it sort of an intellectualized version of a party, but it was going to be a lot of fun. And I signed up to hear one, and in future years, a couple of the other distinguished speakers who came to this lovely affair. And the first time I went and attended, I had my wife with me, and we wanted to just be part of this, but I didn't know historians. I had talked to Ron briefly, I'd talked to John Brazenly a bit, but I didn't really know the historians. And so Nancy and I were just standing there wondering where we would sit when Ron waved me over. Come on over here, sit with Robbie and me. And that's what we did. And that introduced me to Robbie. This was many years ago. And they're a wonderful couple. We had a lovely evening, Nancy and I, with the historians. But I liked the fact that Ron was considerate of me as an outsider. He was kind and wanted me to be part of the group. So that is a vivid memory. It's amazing. We remember things that make a difference in how we feel. And let's fast forward now to about 10 years ago. I retired. Ron had already been retired. And he was running one of the ARF, or retired faculty book groups. I didn't know anything about it, so I called him up, and he encouraged me to come. They read a wide variety of novels and nonfiction, and so I liked that idea. And the group would meet about once a month in someone's home. And we read a wonderful variety of books. As a geographer, I'd been reading a lot of social science and geography for the last 30 years, and history too. So I love the fact that it broadened my reading horizons, and I love the congeniality, the spirit that Ron provided in his leadership of this Tuesday afternoon book group for the retired faculty. And one of the things that struck me too, most every time we had a meeting, Ron would be sitting next to his wife, Robbie, where possible. And they seemed to be so much of a loving partnership, a team running the book group perhaps, but not in the slightest bit of an aggressive or oppressive way to the rest of us. We all had so much chance to speak our minds about books. But Ron had sort of a quiet demeanor in the book group. Whenever we had a question dealing with history, he would answer it succinctly and would offer his own opinions. And as a result, the group of 6 to 9 people at various times just had a wonderful time, as I have. And because Robbie was a very important part of this group and has taken over the leadership since Ron had to leave for Aegis, I like to think of Ron as a partner and a husband to his dear wife, Robbie. I like to think of them as a team, and that will be my strongest memory of Ron Schaffer. Thank you.
This is a show I don't think we're going to take on the road. It's getting up and down here. It was wonderful to hear all these memories, and I was just reminded of one last thing when Jim spoke about Robbie and Ron. At one point, Ron said to me, I'm going to go have some surgery done on my sinuses. And I said, really? That's a very dangerous operation. I know that you have to sign a form that says it may cause brain damage or it may cause blindness. I said, why on earth do you want to do that? He said, I want to be able to kiss my wife. True story. All right, there is time. At 4:45, we're going to have wine and some goodies, but there is time still for anybody who'd like to talk, and I think Bill, brother-in-law, would like to talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't really belong in a group like this. I never got more than 60 credits beyond my master's, and I only taught college for 1 year at the American College in Paris. But I knew Ron before any of you did, and the man that you knew was a result of his parents, and I got to know his parents, and I'd like to just tell you a little story about the very early days. In 1953, I'm a trombone player, and besides being a teacher and a writer and a magician and too many other little things, but the point is that I met a piano player at a jam session on Long Island from Princeton. And he liked the way I played, and he said, why don't you come out to Princeton? Our trombonist has just graduated. Well, I went, and they liked me, and I liked them, and I went to Princeton for 3 years and never went to a class. But the most interesting thing was that Princeton had a band called the Tigertown Five. And the history of this band goes back into the 20s. But at the particular time that I joined them, they were on their way up, and they were one of the most popular Dixieland bands on the East Coast. And we used to travel to all of the different colleges up and down the coast. And the highlight of our career was playing at Grace Kelly's wedding in Monaco. But that's getting ahead of the story. It turned out that we had a job in New York at the Child's Paramount Theater. It wasn't really a theater, but it was underneath the Paramount Theater. If any of you are from the East Coast, you might know the Paramount Theater, or what used to be the Paramount Theater. And I had just broken up with a girl, and I was looking to meet someone, and we had a mailing list. And one table came in with 6 girls. And I went over to the table and I said, would you mind giving me your names and addresses for our mailing list? So they all filled out these cards, and I put them in my pocket. Oh, it gets better. I had a friend who was studying, what's the term, not calligraphy, but the art of reading handwriting that reveals personality traits and intelligence and all kinds of things like that. And I asked him, I said, I've got 6 cards here. Could you put them in the order of how much they like jazz? And so he analyzed them very carefully, and he gave them to me. Here they are, 1 through 6. Well, it turned out I called the girl who was number 1 on the list, and she had another engagement, so she couldn't come. I was going to school at NYU at the time. I didn't have much money, and my idea of a cheap date was to take a girl to one of our concerts and let her enjoy our music. So she couldn't make it, so I called number 2, and guess who number 2 was? Number 2 was Ron's lovely younger sister, Louise. And believe it or not, I was very shy with girls at that time, and when she opened the door to their apartment, it was just as if we were friends for life. And we got married, but I'm getting ahead again. The interesting thing was I'm going to NYU, and I'm dating Ron's sister, And his mother, we called her Mother, her name was Goldie. She had such a big heart because I had to commute out to Long Beach, an hour out of the city, to come back in 5 days a week. And she said, listen, Ron's down at Princeton from Monday through Friday. Why don't you stay in his room? And then when he comes up on the Saturday, you go down to Princeton and play down there. And it'll work out very nicely. You won't have to travel. And it'll work out for him because we'll have somebody in his room. And they knew it was safe because it was a long, squeaky hallway, and Ron's room was at one end, and Louise's room was at the other end. But love will find a way, and that's just the way it happened. Due to their generosity and kindness and Ron's schedule at Princeton, I have now 2 lovely boys and a whole different kind of a life, and we had a wonderful life, I think 39 years together. No, 49 years together. Before she passed away in 2003. So Ron lost her before we lost him. But I didn't get to know Ron that well personally, except when I would come out to the coast and I would look up Ron and Rob, and we would go out, generally have Chinese food together and catch up with each other. But since you mentioned, one of your speakers mentioned his sense of humor, I would like to share a joke with you that I didn't get a chance to tell Ron, but I know he would have enjoyed it. May I do that? Would you mind? It's a story that, it's not that long a story. It's a story concerning Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It seems that Sherlock had just finished a very difficult case, and Watson says, you know, Sherlock, you've been working very hard. I think you deserve a vacation. Why don't we get away from London? We'll go up into the Scottish Highlands, out into the fresh air. We'll do some fishing, catch some trout, eat our own food, camp out, and enjoy nature and get away from the hustle and bustle of London. So they do that. So there they are up in Scotland, and they set up camp. And they're way out in the country, and it's quiet, and the birds are chirping, and the air is fresh. And they fish, they catch some wonderful fish, and they cook them up and they eat them. And the sun goes down, and Sherlock says, well, it's time to go to bed. So they each get into their sleeping bags, and they're looking up, and Sherlock says to Watson, Watson, what do you think when you look up at the stars? And Watson said, well, Sherlock, it makes me realize that the whole history of mankind is but the blink of an eye. Here we are among the billions of stars and a small solar system among millions of others, and it makes me feel so insignificant that mankind really means nothing in the scheme of things. Tell me, Sherlock, what does it make you think when you look up and see the stars? He says, I think somebody stole our tent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to add anything? I just want to say then one thing, especially since Ron Davis mentioned it. You know, it's hard to know how you feel about visiting someone who's ill. And I had a friend that I lost this year as well. And for me, I was just glad to remember how she was when she was healthy. So I understand for any of you who couldn't make it to Aegis, there's nothing wrong with that. It's what you. All right, let's eat. You want me to go back and? Yeah, sure. They bring out? Okay.
Robbie says we're finished and we can drink some wine. So the caterers are now bringing out the wine. And afterwards, you notice I could sit on her lap. You know, and it could be like a ventriloquist. Said afterwards there's going to be a buffet. A supper. Afterwards there's going to be a buffet. Anything else? That's it.